Hey everybody, Chris Snook here, Token Standard Live, episode 6, and probably I've had some great guests on so far, and we've been fortunate with guys like Mickey McManus and Rebecca Costa talking about complexity, but a lot of what we've been doing the last several episodes has been focused on a Western-centric or a global perspective, but with Western-centric kind of bias. And today, Parag Khanna, my guest, I'm very humbled to have on this. He's sold about 1 million more copies of his books than I've sold of any of mine. And I've probably read at least half of them. My two favorites, we're going to lean into Connectography for Context today. If you haven't read that book, you need to get it. I read it a couple years ago. But The Future is Asian is his newest release. Make sure you have both of these in your Kindle or on your bookshelf. But that's the plug, because we're going to get right into the meat. Parag, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you, Chris. Really can't wait to chat.
And your backdrop's a little nicer than my Airbnb here in Hong Kong, so I'm looking at you in Singapore and remembering how much I love Singapore.
No, we're lucky to live in this longitude, let's say. This is a very sunny, tropical corner of the world that we're in. I think of Hong Kong and Singapore, obviously, this kind of twin axis, each complements the other in many, many ways. And people, as you know, you get into the lingo a bit here. There's a little bit of trash talking between the cities, who's cooler, who's hipper. But the fact is that they're both so much fun. And I come up to Hong Kong for lunch sometimes. It's really no big deal. So we are twin cities over here.
Well, I'm in town. This is my first trip to Hong Kong, and it's awesome to be doing a topic on The Future is Asian with you, because I know it's so much more than China. It's so much more than even Singapore, and we'll get into that on the next 45 minutes or so here for those who haven't had a chance yet to read the book. But yeah, this city's amazing, and Singapore is one of my favorite places. But I will say Hong Kong's energy is palpable, and I'm looking forward to spending the next couple of days here and meeting with several entrepreneurs on my side tomorrow and just getting a little bit of a grassroots feel for what they're all about. So talk to us about kind of just give the layman's 30-second, minute-long version of how you got here for those who don't know you yet. And then why is The Future Asian? Let's just go right into it, and then I'll just be a curious listener and do my best to pull out as many nuggets as I can.
Cool. Well, thanks. That's a great setup. And actually, since we were just talking about Hong Kong and Singapore, in Connectography, I had all of these maps around global cities and city networks. And let me remind everyone that Singapore and Hong Kong were the first two cities in Asia that achieved the rank of global cities in terms of the measurement of the volume and the value of the flows of goods, services, capital, people, data, and so forth through their territory. So there's something special at these two cities. Now, on the back of that, you got Tokyo, Shanghai, Sydney, Seoul, a wide range now across the region of pulsing, thriving financial centers, metropolises, mega cities that are all deeply connected to each other. And they form this kind of collective urban Asian ecosystem and network that is really propelling the region to spectacular growth, because there's so much capital that is being funneled in and around the region to really transform the infrastructure, the economies, develop the growth and educate people, and build, create this kind of inclusive growth paradigm that is kind of the mantra of economies in the region. And that's what drew me here, and I should say drew me back in a way. I was born in India, actually, and I grew up partially in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, mostly in New York and Germany. So I'm a New Yorker, but I grew up being called an Asian American. And now that I moved back to Asia, I call myself an American Asian. And that's one of the terms that I coin in this book, The Future is Asian, because the term never existed, because we always assumed that migration was a one-way ticket. People want to move from the east to the west. People want to move from the south to the north. But what I have seen and documented is that I see millions, not just me, not just little old me, millions of people moving from west to east and from north to south, right? And so that's why I think of myself as an American Asian, and I'm surrounded by American Asians now here in Singapore. You've got lots of them in Hong Kong. They're all over the region, and they're also helping to drive the innovation agenda in some of the developing countries, because who doesn't know a young American or British or German or French entrepreneur in his 20s who's decided to move to Bangkok or to Jakarta and has this startup there, So we are, in a way, Asians have been a huge contribution to the American workforce and educational system. And now talented Americans are making big contributions to the Asian future as well.
Yeah, so you said a lot there, and I want to keep building on that. So Token Standard, because we hadn't talked about this in the green room, we serve three audiences. One is what we call the smart money audience. This is people that are trying to figure out, and their sole job revolves around understanding where capital is flowing to and away from, and to get in front of that. So smart money managers, fund managers, that's one audience. The other audience would be enterprise C-level executives. You can go from the middle market all the way up to large, Fortune 100, but C-level executives or VPs and above inside of a large Fortune 1000 type that are, again, trying to understand the impacts of globalization, of geo arbitrage, of all these things on their workforce, on their resource base, and also on their competitive matrix. And then the third is the one you hit on last, which is that founder technologists, whether they are blockchain based or whether they're just AI or VR or technology driven, that person who's basically trying to disrupt something, an industry or a status quo, and who is listening to this because they're trying to understand the enterprise and kind of geopolitical macro, but really use it as a way to hone in on how they're going to focus on driving their micro, growth, whatever their micro target is. So a broad base of people, but people that we ultimately believe when you connect the enterprise and the capital and the technology base is what's driving all the economy today. And the reason why I say that for your sake is so you understand kind of the three different audiences that are listening to this specific broadcast. But why I think your books are so important, especially the last two, is that when you talk about connectography and needing a new map for the world, what's fascinating to me about that, for those who hadn't heard of that book or don't have that as an understanding of why the future is Asian, is so not only timely, but right, in my opinion. Again, just my opinion, but I share that, I think, with a lot of other people who have followed you and read you, that we went through colonialism, we went through Americanism, we went through these different isms, right? And now we are in a new one. And I'll let you kind of pick up on that and tell us, kind of how we got here and where you think we're heading and why.
No, it's a great set of points there. And of course, I love the way you're talking about the financial and a technological audience at the same time. These are the two dominant industries of our day. In some ways, especially at the intersection you work at, they're two sides of the same coin. Again, I look a lot at the leapfrogging effect and how, that's really catapulting this region, even the poorer countries. But the big picture that kind of drives me to this is looking at connectivity, as you mentioned. For me, connectivity is the physical infrastructure that unites all of us. It's what's caused the shift away from states and borders towards markets and supply chains. And connectivity is not just, railways and pipelines and electricity grids. It's also obviously the internet cables and the satellites and the data flows. And to me, this web, this very dense network of global connectivity is empowering cities and the residents of cities more than anyone else in the world. And that's where you're seeing this leapfrogging, massive economic modernization, very rapid, accelerated innovation, deployment, taking the best practices and business models from around the world and being able to apply them in your own country. So this is how I sort of evolved from focusing more on kind of the big picture geopolitics of empires and states and armies towards this much more kind of granular story of places like the where you're sitting right now, the Greater Bay Area. And I've produced some maps of the infrastructural integration of the Greater Bay Area as what is now officially the world's largest city, and how the massive population size, infrastructure integration, economic diversification, and so forth have contributed to making it one of the key centers of the world economy. And one of the fun facts I have in my last book was saying that Greater Bay Area, the GDP is pretty significantly larger than Argentina, right, as a country.
Right. Yeah. Well, and you said, I walked by a pile of concrete today on my way back from lunch, and I thought of you because you were the one who told me in one of your books, I can't remember, that The stat was, I think, China consumed more cement between 2010 and 2013 than America did in the entire 20th century. I was like, that's a number. And I walked by some concrete today, and I thought of that stat as I was getting ready to this. But it's so let's talk about, let's contextualize this around. There's 5 C's that you talked about for context around territorial countries, network cities, regional commonwealths, cloud communities, and stateless companies. Now, you can weave this into your answer however you want, but those are the 5 C's that you speak a lot about in your books. You also talk about that right now, when we live in a supply chain world, which I think most people, especially the large enterprise people listening to this, maybe the smart money managers, they deal with this on a daily basis, or they think about it a lot more maybe than your startup founder types do. But if you live in a supply chain world, you also say in a direct quote, we'll need a much more sophisticated glossary of power. And that the first step is to map authority and connections rather than only states and their divisions. And so one last tee up for you, and then you can rant for however many minutes you need. When we talk about walls and borders and immigration and things like that, that's one piece of the puzzle. But when you say something like to map authority and connections rather than only states and their divisions, what is the role of borders and divisions, and what is the risk of protectionism or populism as we see taking off in different parts of the world, and this whole new notion that Asia is connected to more of itself and the rest of the world than it ever has before, and that may be a risk or an opportunity for those who are thinking they have it?
Wow, that is super complicated, but that
you wrote the book on it. I'm just
right, exactly. But you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's an extremely sort of complex interplay of the 5 C's, right? The countries, the commonwealths, the cities, the companies, the communities, and the way those intersect with each other, and the kind of global flows of data, of talent, of capital, and so forth across them. That's kind of what connectography was all about. And then applying it to just this vast Asian region is what the futurization is about. So to me, it's kind of one big stream of consciousness in a way that kind of mashes together, and I try to make sense of it. So let's start with the kind of global level, because a lot of people look at the world and they see populism and borders and xenophobia and protectionism. It's like factually not true, right? I mean, what the US and UK are doing, or Serbia and Hungary, is not exactly representative of the planet Earth. There are some things that simply cannot be subject to this sort of constant fake news barrage, which is the fact is most of the world population is bringing down borders. Most of the world's countries are making it easier to migrate to their countries. Most countries want more free trade, more globalization, less protectionism, more liberalization, and so on and so on and so on. That particularly applies to Asia, but not only to Asia, right? Even within Europe, you may have some countries turning inward on demographics, but they really want stronger free trade agreements with Asia, for example, because they see a fast growth there. So there's contradictory trends, there's overlapping, issues at play here. So I just, want everyone to remember, though, that especially if you're based in, London, New York, Silicon Valley, whatever, there are these global patterns that are almost antithetical to what's going on in our home countries, right now. And those are the trends that are going to win the day. I don't mince words in connectography. It is the most powerful law of history, literally. It's the most fundamental trend about humanity, is not our tribalism, but that we relentlessly build connectivity, because we don't have universal evidence that we're always tribal. In fact, for example, the demographic diversity of countries has increased, right? European countries have more foreigners living in them as a percentage of their population than before, the OECD countries. So you have more diversity, you have less tribalism actually demographically within countries than before. So no matter any way you slice some of these arguments that we think are universal, they're not. The one constant is that for 100,000 years, people move to cities and we build infrastructure to connect cities to each other. End of story, open and shut. The only 2 things you can say about all of the human species for 100,000 years are those 2 statements. Everything else is only partially true, but it is always true that we gravitate towards cities. Most of the world population now lives in cities. That has been accumulating for 100,000 years, right? This infrastructure build out, building like, you know, the concrete in China that you mentioned earlier. Now that's happening like all over the world, right? It's the internet cables, it's again, the pipelines, the railways, all of that is snowballing right now. You know, we're just a couple of decades in since the end of the Cold War, which has allowed the whole world to actually get connected to itself in ways that were frozen before. So we're just getting underway to some degree with this global connectivity revolution, as I like to call it. And Asia has been very pragmatic. You know, Asia's full of, quite frankly, it started out just a few decades ago as billions of poor people, right? And that's not what it is anymore, because they've been doing the right things, the smart things, very pragmatic governments, massive infrastructure investment, rapid urbanization, taking advantage of young populations, capturing the global supply chains, becoming the world's factory floor, investing in leapfrogging through education and digitization. All of those things are happening here. Basically, I'm not saying that it's perfect. It's far, far, far from it. But look at the big picture. You know, every region of the world, whether it was Europe during the Industrial Revolution, America in the 19th and 20th centuries, you know, every region of the world deserves to and kind of gets the stars to align in their favor for a few decades in a row. And that's what's happening in Asia right now. You know, it's not that it's some kind of gravity-defying thing. It's just Asia's moment in the sun. You know, Europe had its time. America at its time, and Europe is still there. Europe's still very important. So is America. Asia's just having its turn. It's just following that pattern of history. The world I see is one that's multipolar. Asia is just taking its rightful place alongside Europe and America. It's not replacing them. It's not challenging them. It's not burying them. There's not a new Cold War. It's just that it's a multipolar world, and that takes some psychological adjustment. But it's something that's already kind of well underway.
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's, I mean, first of all, I will tell you that, and this is absolutely as like no BS as I can say. I consider myself to be a pretty good writer. When I read your last two books, I'm going between him and whoever the hell edited this stuff.
It's the editor.
Yeah, that's what everybody who's humble says. But I will tell you this is, for those who have not read it or who have, I think you'll be shaking your head. Yes, it is two of the best written books, considering the complexity of what you're saying. As I was reading the newest one on the plane, I literally was reading it like, and then I had to stop highlighting stuff because I realized almost like every sentence I was like, well, now I'm going to note that. I'm going to note that. I'm like, I felt like I was back in college. Everything was just yellow. And I'm like, all right, so this is just really well written. There's no fluff or no waste in it. So kudos to you for that. When you talk about infrastructure and connectivity, and I love that you're so, you know, hey, facts are facts, and some of this is partially true. This is true. These two things are true. We build cities, and then we build infrastructure to support these cities, and we've been doing that for 100,000 years. We talked about the 5 C's earlier. Stateless companies. Now, stateless companies are, I would think, you know, for the layman's version, companies that operate in multiple jurisdictions and in a multipolar world really well, meaning they operate all over the world, and they operate in a localized way in the regions that they do on a global scale. Yet at the same time, we have recent case studies like Huawei, right? And some of the things that is happening between this, you know, polarization around 5G networks, or, you know, is someone listening to me on my Mate 10 device, which I actually am one of the few Americans. I love the Huawei phones. I figure if someone's listening to me, at least they have to translate English into Mandarin versus English into English. So that's my joke when I meet people that say, oh, you have a Huawei phone. But, you know, when it comes to 5G connectivity, which is a massive game changer, right, for all these things you're talking about connectivity-wise, and self-driving cars and all the zero latency type stuff that becomes enabled in a supply chain world. How do we reconcile these political dogmas and these kind of, I would say, ignorance is a problem, right? Ignorance is the true competition, because we want to make everything about a Cold War. We want to make it all about that. How do we reconcile that and stateless companies that have a state sponsor, whether it be American or Chinese, that all of a sudden becomes a friction point? What do you think happens, or how do we solve some of that? Who do we need to communicate to, and what?
You know, it's a great question. I haven't heard, you know, that this proposition that, you know, a state-sponsored company can be a stateless metanational. And the thing is, there is a tension there. And therein lies part of the solution and the answer to what I think is going to happen, because a truly stateless company is one that doesn't have its dominant market share in its own country, and one that isn't so tied to that country that it winds up being sort of an obstacle to their progress, right? So when you think about Huawei, they're in a situation where they'd like to be, you know, a truly global company, accepted everywhere, operating everywhere, and diversifying their revenue base, but they can't because of this sort of, you know, this perception, real or false, probably real, you know, that they have ties that are a bit too strong to their home government. So that's almost the opposite in terms of structure from a true metanational company, like a, you know, commodities trader. I mean, metanational companies tend to be headquartered in places like Singapore and Switzerland, not China. So in a way, Huawei is a traditional multinational company. It has its home country as its largest market, but is expanding rapidly around the world. And that politicization of the company will not prove to be its undoing. I mean, right now, how could you ever say that about a country that, you know, is 30+% market share, right, in telecom equipment? But it will propose severe limitations on how much that market share is going to grow. Now, what's also happened is the more important law of history is the law of technology diffusion, right? We've got rapid technology diffusion, and we've got this politicization. So you put the two together, and you've got, you know, countries freezing out Huawei for a while in order to build up the capacity to compete in 5G with their own companies. So this might be a godsend for, you know, Ericsson and Nokia and whatnot to get back in the game around this. So I think we're going to see a marketplace emerge, as we do in every other area of technology. Whenever I hear people say you've got a bipolar AI arms race, you know, the world has a choice, American AI or Chinese AI, I just have to laugh at some level, because it's sort of like focusing on today's misperception at the expense of the kind of long-term reality. I mean, every single technology diffuses, and diffuses faster than ever before. The notion that 10 years from now, there are going to be only 2 AI superpowers is preposterous. If ever there was an area where you're going to have truly metanational stateless companies offering AI as a service and really promising to protect data and not sell it to the highest bidder or beholden to a government, it's AI. So to me, it's kind of crazy. SoftBank and Google are actually out there, you know, trying their best to fund those companies and to drive it, whether it's, you know, Fractal Analytics out of India, Element AI out of Canada, and so forth. So you're going to have tons of competition in AI, and you don't have to choose between Baidu and Google. It's utterly ridiculous. And you can see that reality today is certainly around the corner as well. So I don't really believe in this kind of bipolarity. So Huawei is in a way a wake-up call, and that's the way all of these things work. You get a Sputnik moment, you know, whatever you want to call it, but it's not a bipolar world, because you have these metanationals that you didn't have before, and you're certainly going to have them in every category of technology.
Yeah, no, I again, really important for people to read more books and turn off the cable news. I think, right? Regardless of where they tune into the cable news or who's censoring it. Let's go back to a comment you made earlier, and again, let's talk about some of the things that I know you've spoken at length about the last couple of months since the launch, related to permanent, you know, substitutions and things like that. But one of the things through the lens that I have when I look at through my VC lens and my, you know, entrepreneurial lens, you know, what I've noticed we'll call it last 24 months specifically, when we had the crypto bubble of, you know, the last 12 and a half months. And now we're in this nice period of winter where people are actually getting back to work and building real code again. But when we had that bubble, and whenever we have these technology bubbles, right, we have all this talent flooded. So you would talk about that as labor flows and things like that. But, you know, one of the things that I think about, and I don't know if I should be concerned about it or not, and so I'm looking to you, what is with the ability now, with connectivity and with the people putting down, like you said, more people than not looking to build bridges versus walls, put up walls, you know, nomadic kind of entrepreneurship. And I don't mean like someone who's just doing gigster stuff. I'm talking about people that have, you know, not been able to get what they wanted in China because certain things were banned, or in the Americans because SEC wouldn't make a decision, is trying to regulate new currency supplies and new technologies with 1933 law, right? And so people are out there and entrepreneurs are out there like water, right? Least resistance, finding that path. And so last year I saw more people set up entities in Switzerland and Singapore and in Cayman and in Malta and in, 50,000 other places, Berlin. And there was this massive kind of traveling and almost, like you said, American migration externally, right, to these different geo areas. And I lived in the summer, all in the Baltics all summer. And, there wasn't a lot of that activity up there, but I saw people almost caravanning around. And so I wonder what happens if you play it too slow or too close to vest and the talent, meaning the entrepreneurial talent, finds a home, whether it's in Asia, wherever it is, that is open arms saying, listen, we want to regulate certain things. We want to not regulate other things. Here's the roadmap, build it. What are the real risks to that? Or what do you, from your perspective on this side of the planet, what do you see happening there? Is that overplayed, or is that a real potential opportunity and simultaneous threat to the status quo?
I don't see risk in this. I see opportunity. Again, talent is going to flow to places that are going to offer that entrepreneurial environment, let people have that sandbox kind of approach and culture to solve, to innovate, to develop, and then to be able to export it from there. And there's nothing wrong with that competition to incorporate in Switzerland or Singapore or Hong Kong or Estonia and so forth, and to treat the world. And again, these are the micro metanationals, right? Starting out in Estonia and going global and becoming a global utility like a Skype or a TransferWise and these other kinds of companies that are emerging. I think it's extremely positive development because they clearly are not serving any one particular political purpose at all. So I'm a big fan of this, and this is all part of the different levels of competition that exist: regulatory competition, tax competition, innovation, ecosystem competition, and so forth. Competition among cities to provide the most talented workers at an affordable cost, right? This kind of thing. There's a graduate student, a former graduate student in computer science here in Singapore who does some coaching and coding that we know. And he's originally from India, and he was over in Cluj, Romania recently. In Cluj, you may know, is this town, a couple hours, I guess, from Bucharest.
Yep.
And it's branding itself as the new low-cost, tech coder programmer hotspot in Eastern Europe. And what's so funny? He went over there, and maybe they were saying this just because he's Indian, but they were like, what? Our goal is to be the next Bangalore. They literally, so people in Romania, in the European Union, are saying, we want to be the next Bangalore. And actually, if you slice it, turns out that the average wages in tech in Cluj, Romania, are lower than Bangalore, India today, right?
Yeah.
So they, for valid reasons, I see Bangalore as a role model. So this is
the real
geo
thing.
arbitrage. You use this term geo arbitrage, global arbitrage. I love that. I love that term. And that's exactly what's going on here.
No, I mean, it's real. We were in Vilnius, Lithuania in June, and I didn't know this until we were there. I was emceeing an event, and in the prior 18 months, Lithuania had raised over $500 million in startup funding through ICOs and things like that. But still, $500 million came into Vilnius, Lithuania. The country had, the whole region between Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia has like 6.5 million people in it. And on a per capita basis, they raised more money than any other technology startup region in the world in 2017. And whether that means they raised too much or whatever isn't the point. It's the fact that that much capital flowed into an area, which then again, talent will follow that capital. And if that talent stays at all, you've now all of a sudden you've seeded something really interesting, right? Now, doesn't mean it couldn't get messed up. It just means that I think these areas where there's hunger, there's opportunity in ways there maybe hasn't been before. There's idea share and capital flows. I think it's a really exciting time, and I also think it's a time that resting on your laurels is not going to pay off too well over the next 10 years. Thinking that the arrogance that what is will stay is again historically just a fallacy, number one. But
Well,
I think it's more fragile than ever because things can be so moved so rapidly.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because, you know, one of the things that's really sort of struck me in the last 2 months that I've been traveling around the US and UK and Canada on this book tour is the conversations about, you know, catching up versus leapfrogging. And what I have to explain to people is that whereas they look at Asia and they say, oh, well, you know, they've been so poor so long, they're finally just starting to catch up. It's like, no, dude, you don't get it. They're leapfrogging. You know, WeChat is better than what you've got, you know, and, you know, it would be a humiliation for a Chinese person to use American social media, you know, sort of apps and technology. And quite frankly, if you look at the microeconomic level, you know, this is one of the things I point out in the book. As you know, we Americans need to cash checks, you know, and some people have to go and get payday loans. You know, you don't do this stuff when you have a financial ecosystem like WeChat and Alipay and so forth. Then when it comes to phones, it's kind of hilarious because, you know, I've got my iPhone right here, and yet here in Singapore, my trainer at the gym and my assistant, they use either Huawei or Samsung or Xiaomi, and they're like, you use Apple? Like, you are so lame. They don't think it's the gold standard in hardware. They think it's rubbish. You know, you don't know if it's really waterproof. The battery dies after like half a day, you know, and it's heavy, you know. They think it's and you know, meanwhile they've got their 40 megapixel phones at a fraction of the cost. So you know, we've got to get used to this fact that they're not just catching up. It's the democratization of technology. Again, as I said, the iron law of history is accelerated technology diffusion, right? And that is allowing Asian countries, even poor ones, not just to catch up, but to leapfrog. There's some areas where they're just catching up. You know, obviously they don't have like, you know, Scandinavian welfare states over here in Asia, outside of Japan. But in other areas, they're leapfrogging.
Well, you know, and again, when you talk about connectivity, to me, it comes right back to that. We think they're catching up. I mean, when I say we, I'm putting myself in first person with, you know, with the American or the Western kind of bias, saying, oh, the rest of the world's catching up. And what we forget is that we've got legacy infrastructure that served us for and was an accelerant at the time. Whether you want to talk about, you know, Visa, MasterCard infrastructure, whether you want to talk about checks, right, and payday loans. When you go to places where they didn't have people with documented identities, which there's still somewhere around 2.5 billion people don't have an identity, right? We know that about 2.5 billion people are unbanked. When you go to places around the world, whether it's Asia or any part of the rest of the world, and you go from not having any of that to all of a sudden everyone has, you know, a piece of hardware that's $1,000 piece of hardware that's been subsidized and it has more power than the president had at his fingertips 15 short years ago. Right. You're not playing it. You're not even playing the same game. You're not playing catch up. This is a whole new world. They don't have to unlearn stuff. There's no legacy infrastructure that has to be dealt with and powers that be that have to be sorted out. It's kind of like, I read recently, I think it was in something that you wrote. And so I apologize if it wasn't, and I'm misrepresenting it, but that China, you know, like a driver's license or a license plate is somewhere around $14,000 a US equivalent to get a license plate. And there's a waiting list that only a fraction of a percent of people even get on that lottery. But if you get an electric vehicle, they're giving it to you for free. Well, talk about incentives, right? Like, what am I going to drive? I'm going to drive a gas car or I'm going to drive a electric vehicle. And who am I going to buy that from? Am I going to buy it from an American company or a German company? I want to buy it from a Chinese company that makes one, you know, who knows, right? But the point is that EVs in China or in Asia, where they were on bicycles and there was no infrastructure around gasoline, can take off. They're not catching up. They're going to bury the rest of the world.
And this is the combination of what's called second mover advantage, right? Not first mover advantage, but it's the advantages of late development. You know, this is now a classic story of, you know, not having copper wires, so jumping to mobile and so forth. But the all important thing being the regulatory side that you just mentioned, you know, the incentives. So government's saying, we really don't want our, atmosphere, you know, to be destroyed any further, you know, through our own kind of self-inflicted, rapid, you know, carbonized economies. Let's instead leapfrog. Let's do more electrics and big, you know, sort of governments with the capacity to have to significantly incentivize this kind of behavior, and that becomes market setting. It's you know, an example, electric cars in China is a good example, because the car market is so big that suddenly even Western car makers change how and what they produce, because they want to be able to sell those automobiles across the world, and you might as well comply upwards to the Chinese standard. And the EU has been doing that for years, in automotive and chemicals and a whole host of areas, food safety, and now China is starting to do it too. And I think that's very positive.
So I'm going to give you. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to give you enough time to go, because I'm going to put you on the spot here. But the thing I want you to do is, I talked to you about the three audiences. So you can pick any order you want, and it doesn't matter. You can talk to the smart money, you can talk to the executive / C-level person, or you can talk to the startup founder entrepreneur. And you're going to give them three different pieces of advice. Now, maybe you're going to say it's all the same advice, but if you were speaking to one of those people face to face, and you said, a year from now, if you don't do this, you're going to regret it, what is the one piece of pragmatic and yet future thinking advice that they should take from their vantage point and act on immediately?
Whoa. So this is sort of like, obviously, focusing on Asia, right? Is a critical message. Yeah.
Future is Asian, right? And connectography as the underlying, right? The reason why, right? And I'm either managing a large division of a major enterprise, middle market and above. So, $500 million to a couple $1 billion a year enterprise, and I got to make decisions around resource allocation or whatever I'm doing, right? What does this mean to me? That's one idea. Another person is managing, hedge fund, managing a venture portfolio, managing an opportunity zone fund in the U.S., managing any amount of money, right, on behalf of other people's or clients. And their job is to make 7 to 20% IRR, depending on their thing. What does future is Asian and connectography mean to me? What should I be thinking about that's contrarian? What should I be looking at from that lens? And then the last one is someone who just wants to be an entrepreneur and build something and put their time into something with all that risk that might actually be worth doing, right? Even in a high state of failure way. And you say, hey, here's your opportunity, kid, or not kid, if they're, more middle-aged starting again. If I was an entrepreneur right now, here's what I'd be thinking, and here's what I'd be doing, and I would not be focused on anything else. So you can pick them in any order that speaks to you, but just if you were sitting down one-on-one with them, those three personas, what would your advice be as it relates to the futurization and connectivity?
That's a great point. And, here's what I want to emphasize very strongly. There's still billions of poor people in Asia, literally like 3 billion poor people. This unbelievable growth story, the largest transfer of wealth in human history that's occurred with the rise of Asia, is actually involved only half the Asian population, right? The other half is still to come. Right. Yeah. And that's one of these things that I can write it in a book. I can write it in 1 or 2 sentences. And I could even say, let me repeat that, and it still is not going to have the impact of like me saying it right now, to you. There's still a long way to go, in other words, and the technology is accelerating and getting cheaper. And that infrastructure build out is rapid in getting these people online. So just because you may not have been in the first wave or second wave or third wave of entrepreneurs that are discovered Asia, investing in Asia, putting resources in Asia, don't worry, it is not too late. Help these billions of people get connected and leapfrog, and that's going to be extremely profitable in the years ahead. My job, I'll say, as a personal level, if I had to describe my job, it's to go everywhere in the world and find out what's wrong with those places, right? That's what I do. I go to places and I see what's wrong, and I have a long rap sheet, and that's what I've been doing for like almost 20 years now. And I still see so many problems, that need to be fixed. So, go in there with that problem solving mentality, and you'll find a real willingness amongst people and governments that are super pragmatic and embracing those that want to help them help themselves. Great.
So, you brought up the fact, I think, what is it, about 800 million or 1 billion people out of the 7.7 and growing that are on planet Earth live on the Western Hemisphere, meaning North and South America. The other 6.7 billion live in the Eastern Hemisphere, i.e. Asia, Africa, Europe, the Middle East. And and so even if those growth rates stay the same, it doesn't mean don't sell into the Americas. It means that right now, the context most people have is that Americas who bought your stuff. And, back to the C-level advice thing, I'm curious if you would mirror this or if you would add to it, or because I actually want to be better at giving these guys advice. When I talk to American companies, whether they be product companies or whatever, I say, consumerism is dead the way you understand it. It doesn't mean we won't consume. It doesn't mean that. It just means consumerism, the business model of it, how it evolved, is dead on arrival. And if it isn't dead, we need to kill it because it's killing our universe. But even if we didn't, there's 400 million Americans, and 67 or something percent of our GDP in America, $21 trillion a year, comes from consumption. And yet that consumption has been fueled by credit card debt and debt that is no longer sustainable at a personal level. So what are you going to do to bridge to the other 3 billion that don't have a bank account yet, but will because of a smartphone and some other form of thing, right? And what are you going to do to bridge to Asia, where half of those people are still in poverty but won't be? Because if you don't have a bridge to that market, what happens when this one, doesn't do so well, next recession or worse? Right. And so pragmatically, it's like, what are you doing to try and figure out roads to connect your consumption to this other side of the planet that is basically 80-90% of the population anyway?
Mm-hmm. I think you're spot on. So it's so interesting that, you say consumerism is dead. There's consumption, but it's a new kind of consumption. It's certainly growing faster in Asia than the whole rest of the world put together. So you've got to, tailor your approach to the price points of those emerging consumers. Think about the business models. Think about how they're asset light. I mean, one of the things that people have in common all over the world, what differentiates us, maybe whatever the rate of growth is in Asian economies versus the rest of the world, but what unites us is that young people. And you'll be the first to hear this now, literally, because I've not even begun the process of going sort of quote unquote public. But my entire next book is about this. It's about millennials and younger. It's actually called Citizens of Everywhere, and it's about the commonalities around the world of everyone under the age of 40, basically, and how they're viewing the world today. And increasingly, it is, again, irrespective of where you are, it's that they want to be more asset light. They want to be mobile. They have those similar aspirations, and I've got like survey data coming out of my ears. That's why I'm putting all of this together and tracing some of these stories to show this. So come to Asia, look at the lower price points, but think that they do want to have that kind of mobile kind of lifestyle as well. And those are some of the critical commonalities that are going to make for a successful business model, is addressing that type of future consumer, not the consumption of the past.
Right. Excellent. Anything you want to part with or leave as we wind this down? Any final thoughts maybe we should have covered, we didn't? Questions I should have asked that I didn't?
No, it was nice arc, nice thread. Covered a lot of bases there. I'm really glad we got to deep dive on some of these socioeconomic and technology kinds of things that don't get talked about nearly enough.
Well, I've told people we've just met for the first time. I've been following you for a while, but I've told people for the last probably 10 years, there's a handful of books that I list as must reads. And so I'll say it again for people listening to this that know you, but don't know me, or vice versa. But I'm going to add you to that list. So I've always said that, to understand how the current economic monetary system, you really have to read Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin, all about the creation of the Federal Reserve, which was, essentially America's fourth central bank, but what it meant and kind of how it operates. And again, it's not about the conspiracy side, it's about this is our system, right? Mm-hmm. The other book that I said is The Watchman's Rattle by Rebecca Costa, who we had on episode 1, I believe, of this show, is a dear friend of mine. And it can't recommend it enough about how society, when it faces complexity it can no longer deal with, meaning we can't solve the problems we're creating because we're manufacturing them too fast. What happens? What does human brain do?
Right.
Mickey McManus's book Trillions, which talks about IoT and all the impacts of a device-centric environment now that has as many cells in it talking and learning from itself as our human body does, and that will be, you know, larger than civilization in a short handful of years. The Fourth Turning, which is very Western-centric, but the Fourth Turning talks about generational archetypes. And you're writing a book, sounds like the next one, even though you barely just got this one out. I love it. You're just writing the next one already. And then I would put connectography on that. And certainly not to diminish any of the other works, but I just, you know, I feel like for me anyway, what resonated the most was just really understanding the role of connectivity through history, and then where we are today and what you're doing with Future Map and what you're doing to kind of give people a visual demonstration of how the world is being mapped today outside of just these lines on a, you know, on a static map that we call borders. That this is what actually moves the world, your maps. And so you're in my top 5, my friend. And
I appreciate that. I'm honored. Thank you.
And I can't encourage anybody enough to follow you, to read Futurization. Start wherever it leads. I mean, if you've been pulled to that, read that one first, but make sure you get connectography and then read the other ones. And Parag, thanks again, man. And I look forward to hopefully running into you in person one of these days, either in the West or the East. And thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening.